I'm not going to get into all the details of the Roman Republic, but let's just establish it and say that they had democratic institutions, even though they did not have a perfect democracy, much like the United States. They had a republic in which there were republican institutions, meaning things that served the republic, not a monarchy or anything else, but an established state, which has forms of democracy within it. It's not a total democracy. It's not a perfect democracy, right? It's a republic with democratic elements involved. So with that said, you have this tug and this pull, blah, 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 long story. This guy comes and that guy comes, Sulla, Marius, Julius Caesar. Eventually, the Roman Republic it's destroyed. Basically, it comes to an end, technically, according to historians, around the time of Augustus, at the end of Julius Caesar, the crossover from Gaius Julius Caesar to Octavian Julius Caesar Augustus, who adopted Julius Caesar's name after his death. Okay, point being is that is when the Roman Republic ended, right? So I was thinking, we can look at the Roman Republic and see a lot of similarities with the United States, right? This notion of having elitism, not a perfect democracy, but having a republic under democratic principles is very similar to the United States. Now, what is the crossover with the Roman Empire? What happened when the Roman Republic ended, and how can we understand that in terms of the United States? So the way that what just clicked in my head about this is that when we try to understand the United States, we kind of look at it and you say, well, okay, we have a democracy, but we can see that there's these powerful interests such as finance, and that's the main thing, is just quote unquote the top of the pyramid, the top earners getting together and having undue influence on the political process. So we know that that's a fact, because you can introduce unlimited money basically into politics, especially with Citizens United Supreme Court ruling, which firmly ruled on the side of that. Money is free speech. Free speech is unlimited in America. So you have those corruptive elements. But how does the system work? So then what are we? Are we a democracy? Are we not? What is the crossover with the Roman Empire? I think what clicked for me is that the Roman Empire, first of all, was not completely different, especially in appearance, from the Roman Republic. So what does that mean? That means that rather than just getting rid of every aspect of the Roman Republic and just saying, here's the king, he's running everything. No. It was the opposite. They were very, very sensitive about kings even after the Roman Republic. And they knew that the Senate and other Republican institutions were valued parts of Roman society. So how do you adapt that into the context of the end of the Republic? What you do is you preserve some of those Republican institutions. So the Roman Empire under Augustus and the other Julio-Claudian dynasty, which is what I kind of specialize in just based on my own interest, not professionally or anything like that. But that period of time, when you study it, you see they preserve all these Republican institutions except for some. So what they did is they took the government and they reformed it. They changed it. They didn't completely throw out the baby with the bathwater and say the republic is completely gone. In fact, they said we are fighting for the republic. They maintained at least the illusion of a republic, but actually some of its institutions. The Senate remained. They still was legislative bodies such as the Senate and other appointed positions and elected positions, which would select governors in different provinces, levy taxes within Rome, and do all sorts of other things that the government is responsible for doing. So what am I really getting at here? Why is that important? Well, that aspect is very interesting. This notion of the Roman Republic still existing within the new Roman Empire. It's not dead. It's not completely gone. It's just been reformed significantly and changed in critical ways. So the ways that it's been changed, because we just talked about the parts that almost remain the same, right? These different democratic institutions. What was it that changed? Well, they had a problem. So it wasn't, first of all, people need to understand that it's not just power hungriness when we're talking about Rome. They had a problem, and the problem was civil strife and civil war. Right, people did not get along, and this is not simple as, like little Bobby didn't get along with little Susie at playtime in second grade. Like, this isn't about people squabbling even in the streets, even though it happened. We're talking about huge armies fighting against each other that are all Romans. These are civil wars, right? really, really bad for a civilization that's trying to survive and fight off outside forces and thrive and etc. When you're throwing all your people at each other, you're destroying your society from within. So the republic in that way was doomed to fail in the sense that they, for whatever reason, you could call it hot tempers. Maybe the food's just too spicy down in Italy. Whatever your reasoning may be, some would say it's a systemic problem or an institutional failure, or it's just maybe a failure of the decisions of the people at the time. That's a really interesting question in itself. But regardless of whether it was destined or not, or this or that, the point is that it did fail because it was no longer called the Roman Republic. What parts of it failed? Well, certain executive offices, like the consul, had a lot of power in praetors to have military appointments and raise an army. So whenever people went to certain provinces and raised an army, that was often the time when problem came, because they had legions and they wanted power, so they were tempted to use those legions towards power, i.e. Marius, Sulla, Julius Caesar, Augustus, Mark Antony, even Cato with Pompey, all of these guys. This is what they were all doing. But Caesar had a taste for it, and Pompey, and people like that, Sulla. So or Marius, those people became the most controversial because they reached the zenith of power. So what am I getting at? We're going on a tangent, right? Well, actually, it's very relevant, because the point being is that was the aspect of the Roman Republic which was damaged and was not functioning correctly, was the fact that too many people were competing for that peak power position, raising an army here and there, and then having a civil war and etc. So there was way too much inner conflict. So it became apparent that one of the ways you could solve this problem is to get rid of all these power players, have more of a central authority who is controlling certain things. But the important thing to know, I told a long story to tell a very short point, but sadly, but the important point is that you didn't need to destroy the whole system. You just needed to understand, we got to get rid of these competing power structures, or power people holding power, warlords in different places who want to fight each other, senators, warlords, whatever, people who are initiating civil wars. How do we do that? We take away this kind of multi-tiered, you can have a military power here and you can have that. The power of the state is now centralized in certain ways, but once again, it's partially democratic, but the military commands are centralized. So now the Roman military is under the control of a ruler, a ruling family. What else? That ruler also takes control of certain other key things, such as the governorship of key territories, especially Cisalpine Gaul and maybe Greece or whatever, places that are bordering Italy. Right? So that means that nobody else can kind of fuck around and start a war anywhere near Italy, because the only person who has the supreme power to command those people as the princeps, or the first citizen, as Augustus called it, is the imperator, the princeps, the first citizen. He's the guy who has that power. So therefore, you're eliminating certain power structures when it comes to governorship in different territories and building an army. Okay. Now let's do it back to the United States, because we covered Rome now. That's the difference between the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. In the United States, we look at it and we say, well, what is it? Is it the Roman Empire? Is it the Roman Republic? I would say, on this thought process, think of the United States like the Roman Empire. See, we're not a true republic anymore. And that's where the confusion lies. We're like, well, is there some overarching power people who just run everything? Not exactly, because we do have the remnants, just like the Roman Empire did, of the Republic for which we were supposed to function. We still have this kind of shell of a republic, or we have these institutions, even especially locally, up, local government, up to the governor, up to, your senators and your national representatives. We have these things that have some element of democratic play involved, but they're highly compromised, which they always were in Rome as well, even in the Republic. They're highly compromised by elite interests and money. And there's a certain power, this is the theory, there's a certain power, just like in the Roman Empire, Augustus and other emperors or imperators, princeps, who they don't necessarily have control over everything at all times in the society, but they have a kill switch on certain things. Military policy, any major government policy, essentially, because if you think about it, if we're relating it to the Roman Empire, Yes, they allowed Republican institutions to survive, but if the emperor really, really wants something done, he's going to find a way to do it because he has the military and the manpower to do it. Bingo. So that's what we would say about the United States. That's why the foreign policy is so similar from Republican to Democrat. That's why we always support Israel and this and that, because there's a certain element in the upper power structure which they can argue amongst themselves. Maybe they have like power struggles way up at the top behind the scenes, but at some point they're keeping somewhat in the shadows so they can delineate decisions through other people. So that is a theory, and that's a puppet theory, a scapegoat theory, that's the position politicians are in, to take that fire when they are not the progenitors or actual masterminds behind the policy. So to say, like, it's not just saying in a hazy way that there's some man behind the curtain controls everything, but it is postulating that we do function like an empire in the sense that we've kept Republican institutions, but there is some element at play of the superpower structure who, just like the Roman Empire, has a centralized authority on military decisions, on foreign policy, on this and that, and they may have debated amongst themselves, but all we know is that the policy is not necessarily coming from the Republican politicians or the Democratic politicians or think tanks, because there's people that have much more wealth than them. There's the Bilderberg group. There's all these multi-billionaires and trillionaires and, really super powerful, wealthy people who get together. They have way more sway. A lot of politicians are just fucking trying to get on the scene. They're trying to raise funds. They're trying to get someone else to donate them some money. They're not making the most money. They may be able to find lucrative ways to get paid, because there always is in politics. But at the end of the day, they are probably not the major power holders, but they're making the decisions. So therefore, there's some sort of pipeline in the society, whether it be lobby groups or just think tanks or just the power structure itself, having control over capital, having control over media installations, which are constantly being consolidated into smaller and smaller groups. Somehow, there's a similar consolidation of power that's happening in America that happened in the Roman Empire. So therefore, the important thing to understand is, yes, we probably, under this thought experiment, are the Roman Empire. We perhaps were at some point the Roman Republic, or we were always like the Roman Empire. A society that has Roman Republican institutions that appear democratic, but some sort of overarching centralized power structure that dictates things like foreign policy and etc. So I hope that analogy with Rome made sense and educated people on some cool history. Take care. First thing I want to point out is we have to remember when we talk about a tyrant, especially if we're not really super familiar with, let's say, Roman Republican history or what have you, we have to understand that, first of all, the term was not, like, a lot of people know this, it wasn't as bad or like a negative connotation of a term in the past. It was more of a tyrant came from Greek. It meant any ruler who kind of seized power. It could be good, could be bad. It's just someone who has power, an autocrat of sorts. Now, that's important because when we look at people like Caesar, first of all, you can't just look at him as like, oh, he's just trying to steal all the power and this and that. That is one accusation that was made against him, and that is one of the concerns and led to his assassination and so on and so forth, and his enemies capitalized upon it. But ultimately, you have to understand, it's a complicated situation. So when it comes to power, for instance, a populist like Caesar, he may be seizing more than his fair share of power, for sure, in the Republican government. But the question becomes, what is he doing with that power? Who is he subject to, right? Like, what are his plans? So a cynic or a skeptic could say they never want a populist because they're always going to use the power for their own ends and their own, personal family or objectives or what have you. But ultimately, we have to acknowledge that a populist has a lot of potential to change a society, right? They could be a catalyst for change. Why is that? Not only that, but for greater access to power, political power, to everyday people. Why is that? Well, it's simple, right? The populist is making a contract with the people. He's saying, I need your support in a vigorous way. I need your uprisings, maybe even rioting, intimidating, whatever it is. I need you, tribune of the plebs, all these different things that are more like democratic or plebeian institutions, the mob. I need you, the mob, the people, and I will give you this in return. So the question of a populist is, what can he deliver? It's quite really that simple. What are his policies? What can he deliver? Because in actuality, what you could be doing under a populist is actually taking control of the government from a relatively few number of people, such as the Senate, and transferring it to a much larger group of people. That would be the case for populism, right? But there's that potential for corruption because you're seizing power via the use of populist tactics. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, so to speak. But see, what I'm talking about is a perfect description of what happened with Julius Caesar, because first of all, we can't think of Rome as like, oh, it was, super democratic, and then this tyrant just took the power from everybody. No, like, Rome was already a place that was being dominated by patrician families in the Senate who were aggrandizing themselves to incredible amounts of wealth while enslaving thousands of people, while the vast majority of Romans are living in poverty, right? They're living under the poverty line. They need donations of bread from the state just to survive. They're like, their situation is not great in terms of the masses. So they want land, they want opportunities, they want all these, things that people want to advance themselves, to, build equity within their family. So the populace can come and he can offer them these things. Even land, we're going to pay the soldiers, we're going to give you this, we're going to give you that. And people look at it so skeptically, especially people like Cato or, other optimates against the populares on the other side, who were more so, like their name represents, populace, right? So attracting the plebeian, etc. So where are we going with all this, right? Like, well, we made some really good points there. Populists like Julius Caesar and Donald Trump have a lot of potential to do good. But going back to present with people like Trump, I'm not convinced that they're doing that. So therefore, the method or the strategy is fine, but we need somebody who can actually deliver. So therefore, like, I think a lot of the problem we seem to be facing in the modern era is that we're kind of applying populism to people who are within the system. For instance, he said he was going to drain the swamp. He didn't drain the swamp. Just because he had a radically different administration didn't mean we still didn't have tons of swamp-like corruption, billionaires, buying things from the government like they're stocks in our society. I mean, they're divvying shit up to this guy and that guy, this guy. They're cutting certain things. They're cutting taxes for their friends. People are aggrandizing themselves. They're pursuing the same foreign policies, which are extremely unpopular. Over half the country is not supportive of Zionism. Just go down the line. The war in Iran, not popular. Like a lot of other policies. So yes, Trump was elected by popular referendum, but ultimately, this goes back to the fact that the system was already so dilapidated from the post 9/11 era that the Tea Party and Trump and MAGA snuck right in as the we all know this story, a nice alternative to the regular Jeb Bush or whoever else. So it felt really different, but ultimately it still had all the elements of corruption that we see in other situations. So people are doing things, right? They're making businesses, they're making moves. There's things happening in society which are not controlled from the top down. So in that way, the Republican virtue always lived on through Rome because they had the people wanted to advance themselves. They wanted to become merchants. They wanted to do this. The slaves wanted to free themselves. The people had progressive attitudes towards the enhancement or, the progression, the growing process of their own lives, right? So the reason why I point that out is to say that the personal agency is still there, and you can relate that right back to the United States. I'm not saying that we're all like, even though, sometimes I feel like we are mindless drone zombies just clicking from one thing to the next. At least I feel like that, but there's a whole conversation to be had about, the bread and circus and the entertainment and the distractions and the appeasement and the this and that. But at the end of the day, I think people have agency and they have freedom to some degree in our society today that we can be thankful for. And certain freedoms are very important, such as freedom of speech and other foundations of the American Republic. Like the Bill of Rights, like those things, I respect them because I think they have a very strong logic and they play a role, and we'd miss them if they were gone. If you didn't have a right to speech, that would be a problem. So any threat to it, we're usually on top of it. We usually care about it. Any threat to freedom of speech, because it's a form of gross tyranny. I'm off on a tangent, but tangents are fun. So everything plays into it, right? The Bill of Rights, the way we conduct a society in all of the above. But I think the important thing to remember is that when we're trying to understand what exactly how the society runs, it is a semi-free republic with more of an empire, right? Like a Republican face aid, but like we are very top-down controlled. We do have massive wealth inequality. We do have massive dissatisfaction and disenfranchisement with the political apparatus currently. So you could say that we're like the late Roman Empire or the late Roman Republic, right? That is where we stand essentially. And you look at that because people are so fed up with the institutions, they don't believe in them anymore. So they keep on going and everything, but that's what makes it look like a Roman Empire. It's like, okay, well, these guys are going to run shit. We're going to have to pick between Hillary or Trump, whatever, that kind of thing. So locally, we may have more control, but the national system does seem to be on that kind of empire route. So you could go Spartacus, right? You could advocate violence. I don't like to advocate violence, but it is a major historical traditional driver of change, right? When people like Caesar or anyone else really wanted to get something done, at the end of the day, you really probably did it at the point of a sword. I've always said that, violence in history is kind of something where rubber meets the road in terms of development, in terms of destruction, chaos, creation, down the line, right? We have violent contact, but 90% people are killed by germs in the indigenous Americas, but several hundred Spaniards are able to rout tens of thousands of indigenous people. Of course, the disease helped a tremendous amount, but they had steel, they had horses, they had whatever other psychological advantage, So, I mean, where am I really going with this? It's like this is just a sprawling conversation. Patrick Gallagher, he referenced some books that were been very influential in the historical field, and the contents of those books are essentially saying that violence has always been there since the beginning of human civilization. There used to be a trend in the historical field to say, like it wasn't violent. People got violent later on, and we need to kick this habit because this isn't even in our nature. Like they just had this, like I guess they'd call it a presumption in the academic field that like people were peaceful, like kind of how they had the presumption that we extincted the megafauna after the Ice Age, which has never been proven that the extinction was caused by humans. They had the assumption that humans came here about 13,000 years ago. They taught us to that in school when I was growing up, and turns out no, the humans have been in the Americas for over twice as long as that. They may have came here from sea route corridors. In fact, they may have had to because of blockages, because there was a certain opening at 13,000 years ago, but then that closed. So the field has changed tremendously. There's some great sites like the Galt site in Texas and others that have really expanded that field. That are really exciting and interesting. So anyways, the story that academics tell about history as they understand it are constantly evolving. Saying like violence is one driver of social change. So there are others, there's activism, there's the political apparatus, right? Like there are all these things. So if you think about it, like we kind of need like a perfect little mix, like the Powerpuff Girls, like some sugar, some spice, and everything nice, like we need a little push here and a little like legislation there. We need like, a little riot here, like a little like populism there, like, a little bit to balance it all out. Like there's always going to be powerful factors. There's always going to, as far as we can see directly into the future. I know that a lot of us, they're socialists and they're communists and they're fucking anti-Zionists and they're free Palestine and they're all these different groups, pansexuals and non-gender conforming and anarchists and, there's so many fucking labels and subdivisions. But at the end of the day, like, what is the plan? Like, what are they all really fighting for? So to help, maybe that's God's plan. That's God's tapestry that we don't even have to like plan it. There's like a hive mind bigger than it that's like using each little subculture and part to like play that little thing. You know what I'm saying? So like that's what's fascinating about history too, is that you talk about these big concepts, but you're always going to have the micro and the macro. Like you're always going to go from the big concepts to the smaller too. Like some things could be dependent on like, did Caesar go to the Senate that day or did he not? Like I'll give you so many elements of chance in history. It's totally fascinating. Like, go to the, if Hitler didn't invade Russia, like, what, you know what I'm saying? Like, massive differences in supposedly, at least we would assume, based on, major factors like fucking the Nazi party and all these things or whatever, Soviet Russia. Like, there's so many different theories of alternate history. And that's why guys like The Rest is History, and other, Dan Carlin, they like to do alternative history exercises because it's fun for the historical mind to think, like, how would the world be different if that happened instead of that? It's absolutely fascinating. But it comes down to people's passions, people's emotions, like, not always, but sometimes. Like, and maybe it's just their leanings, maybe it's their fear. It depends on the story, it depends on the situation. But, like, the driving factors of why people do what they do, who's to say, man? I don't know. But the more that we are present and the more that we're like looking at the data, or like, like having this conversation and looking at the world through that lens of like, who were we before and how can we do better, right? It's like, again, the micro and the macro, right? Like the society or the culture or the environment, like the ecosystem, is like a broader example with more variables of like what a person's life is internally. Like, you learn as you go. Like, so says a society. Like, if the Roman Empire went through this, and that, like, we should be like evolved from that to some extent. We should understand what happened in their society. We should understand the ways that their government relates to ours so that we can therefore adapt to it. Just as a person has experiences, right? They make mistakes. They have certain passions. Like, so too does this society, So in figures like Trump and Julius Caesar, we can make really interesting comparisons, even though they're not a perfect comparison themselves. They have different attributes, and they serve a different role altogether, almost, in a sense, one could argue. So I went on long enough, but that was fun to do that, and I hope somebody found it interesting.